The courtroom was a pressure chamber, its walls holding in whispers, judgment, and the unshakable weight of authority. The scent of polished wood and stale coffee lingered in the air, mingling with the low murmur of spectators exchanging quiet remarks. The temperature was neutral, controlled, yet there was something undeniably suffocating about the space, as if the very walls were leaning in, watching, waiting. At the center of it all stood Skylar Hale. She didn't fidget. She didn't shift uncomfortably like the dozens of defendants who had stood in that same spot before her. Her hands were steady, resting at her sides. Her expression was unreadable, not defiant, not fearful, just waiting. She was the only one in the room who seemed in control. Judge Russell Clayton, on the other hand, had made up his mind the moment she walked through the doors. He sat back in his chair, his black robe settling over his broad frame like a king's cloak. The leather of his chair creaked under his weight as he adjusted himself, then exhaled sharply through his nose, a sound of irritation more than anything else. His eyes flicked over Skylar before he finally spoke. "Miss Hale," he drawled, stretching her last name like it was a bad joke. "Do you even grasp the severity of the charges against you?" The murmurs in the courtroom dimmed. The weight of expectation settled onto Skylar like invisible chains. She lifted her chin slightly. "Not a challenge, a calculation. I understand them perfectly, Your Honor," she said, her voice smooth, controlled. That wasn't the answer he had expected. A flicker of something crossed his face, so fast that most wouldn't have noticed. But Skylar did. Clayton leaned forward, resting his elbows on the bench, his fingers clasped together as if preparing to deliver a lecture. "You sure about that?" His voice dripped with condescension. "Because this isn't some online debate forum, Miss Hale. This is a court of law." A few quiet chuckles rippled from the gallery. Skylar let them whisper, let them think she was over her head. They had no idea who they were dealing with. "Your Honor," another voice cut in, smooth, practiced, full of confidence. Gavin Spencer, the prosecutor, rose to his feet. He adjusted the cuffs of his perfectly pressed suit before addressing the court, his voice loud enough to remind everyone in the room that he was in charge of the narrative. "The prosecution would like to present its evidence," he announced. "We have digital traces, security footage, and multiple testimonies that—" "Objection." The word cut through the courtroom like a scalpel. A ripple of shock. Judge Clayton's eyebrow twitched. "Objection," he echoed, his tone both annoyed and amused. "And what exactly do you think you're objecting to, Miss Hale?" Skylar didn't blink. "To the prosecution's premature conclusion," she said. "He hasn't actually presented any evidence yet. Just a claim." The reaction was immediate. A shift. Spencer's jaw tightened. Clayton's fingers curled slightly against the wooden bench. The courtroom was watching now. The tension thickened. Clayton exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Miss Hale, this isn't some college debate team. You are not a lawyer. You are the defendant." She tilted her head, studying him. "And yet," she murmured, "I seem to be the only one following actual legal procedure." Boom. Even Spencer hesitated for half a second before recovering. "Your Honor," he said, smoothing over the moment, "the facts of this case are indisputable. The defendant's IP address was directly linked to the cyber intrusion. We have timestamps. We have data. This is an open and shut case." Skylar let the silence stretch for just long enough. Then she tilted her head. "An open and shut case?" Spencer smirked. "That's right." Skylar gestured toward the evidence displayed on the screen, a digital log showing a direct link between her device and the hacked server. "Let's test that theory," she said casually. "Could you pause the screen for me?" "Right there." Spencer frowned. The screen froze on the exact timestamp the prosecution had provided. "Look at the metadata," Skylar continued, stepping closer. "The digital signature. Can you read that out loud for the court?" Spencer's gaze flicked over the data, his confidence wobbling for the first time. He hesitated. Just a second. But it was enough. Skylar turned toward the jury, keeping her voice even. "If I was really trying to cover my tracks, why would I leave an identifiable trail back to my own personal device?" The room shifted again. This wasn't how the trial was supposed to go. Judge Clayton sat up a little straighter. "Are you suggesting you were framed?" "I'm suggesting Skylar said, her voice unwavering, "that the prosecution has yet to prove I wasn't." For the first time, doubt crept into the air. It coiled around the jurors, curled into the corners of the room. This case was supposed to be simple, a routine conviction. But now, it wasn't routine anymore. Judge Clayton's jaw tensed as he slammed the gavel. "Enough," he snapped. "We'll take a short recess before proceeding." He didn't look at her as he stood. Didn't look at anyone. Skylar exhaled slowly, allowing herself the smallest of smiles. She had come in as a defendant. Now she was the one in control. The courthouse hallway was a tunnel of echoes. Heels clicking, hushed voices, the occasional muffled ring of a phone. Skylar walked through it with purpose, though she kept her expression neutral. She could feel the eyes on her. Some curious, some skeptical. None of them expected her to win. That was fine. She didn't need their belief. She just needed time. Inside the courtroom, Judge Clayton sat behind his bench, rubbing his temple as though the very act of continuing this trial exhausted him. His composure had shifted, still controlled, still authoritative, but there was an edge now. A crack. And cracks had a way of spreading. The moment recess ended, Spencer stood, straightened his tie, and stepped forward with renewed determination. He wasn't about to let a 19-year-old girl dismantle his case in front of a full gallery. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "the defense's attempts to cast doubt on the integrity of this investigation are nothing more than distractions. The facts remain. Miss Hale's device was used in this cyber intrusion. The digital logs are irrefutable." Skylar remained still, her fingers lightly grazing the table in front of her. Judge Clayton glanced at her. "Miss Hale, do you have anything to say before we proceed?" She did. "But not yet. Not at this moment, Your Honor," she said evenly. She felt Spencer's smirk from across the room. "Then let's move forward," Clayton said, nodding to the prosecutor. Spencer turned toward the jury, his voice shifting into performance mode. "This isn't complicated," he told them. "Technology leaves footprints. Every click, every keystroke, every movement online is trackable. And we have those tracks, leading straight to the defendant." Skylar listened, letting him talk. "Now, the defense may try to argue that Miss Hale was framed," he continued, pacing deliberately. "But let's be realistic. Who goes through the trouble of framing a teenager? What motive could anyone possibly have to set her up?" The words hung in the air. The jury nodded along. The logic was reasonable. Skylar counted the seconds. 3, 2, 1. She stood. "Your Honor, I have a question for the prosecution." Judge Clayton exhaled. "Miss Hale, I hope this is relevant." "Oh, it is," she assured him. She turned to Spencer, meeting his gaze head-on. "You said technology leaves footprints?" "Yes," he replied, a hint of irritation in his voice. "And that every keystroke, every movement online is trackable?" "That's right." Skylar nodded. "Then would you agree that log tampering also leaves digital footprints?" Silence. A shift in the air. Spencer's fingers twitched at his side. "Miss Hale," he said, his confidence dipping just slightly. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Skylar turned toward the evidence screen. "I'd like the prosecution to pull up Exhibit B," she said. Judge Clayton sighed loudly, but motioned for the clerk to comply. A moment later, the forensic log of Skylar's alleged hack filled the screen. Skylar took a slow step forward. "Could you zoom in on the metadata, please?" The clerk hesitated, but did as she asked. The screen adjusted. Numbers, timestamps, code sequences. Skylar pointed. "There." The jury leaned in. Even Spencer leaned in. "That," she said, "is a log modification marker. Another shift. A crack. The kind that spreads." Spencer's throat bobbed. "That's a modification marker," Skylar repeated. "It indicates that the data in this log was altered after its original capture." The jury murmured. Judge Clayton sat forward in his chair. Spencer opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Because she was right. Skylar turned back to the jury. "The prosecution just told you that digital trails don't lie. And I agree with them." She let the words settle. "Which is why this is so interesting. Because this digital footprint says that the evidence against me was edited." Boom. The reaction was immediate. Spencer's shoulders stiffened. Judge Clayton's grip on his gavel tightened. The murmurs in the courtroom grew into something louder. Because now, the question wasn't whether Skylar was guilty. It was who had changed the evidence. Judge Clayton slammed his gavel. Enough, he snapped. We will take a brief recess before proceeding. Skylar sat back down. This wasn't just a defense anymore. This was a hunt, and she had just found her first real trail. The second recess didn't feel like the first. Before, it had been a routine pause in a trial that everyone assumed would end in a swift conviction. But now, the energy in the courtroom had shifted. The carefully orchestrated case against Skylar Hale had begun to fray at the edges, and everyone felt it. She sat at the defense table, still measured, though her mind was moving faster than the city outside. She could hear the whispers in the gallery, the frantic scribbling of reporters in the back rows. But most of all, she could feel the weight of Judge Clayton's stare. His patience was thinning. His control was slipping. Good. Across the room, Spencer had retreated to the prosecution's table, flipping through papers with an agitation that hadn't been there before. His confidence had taken a hit. Skylar could see it in the way his hands moved a little too quickly, in the way he was whispering furiously with his team, pretending this was just a minor inconvenience. But she knew the truth. He was scrambling. The gavel struck down again. Court is back in session, Clayton announced, his voice clipped, his jaw tight. He glanced at the jury, then at the gallery, before shifting his attention to the prosecution. Mr. Spencer, do you have anything to add before we move forwards? Spencer straightened his tie, clearing his throat. Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that the evidence provided remains valid, despite the defense's claims. Skylar's lips barely twitched. Clayton exhaled sharply. Miss Hale, do you have a response? She stood, slow and deliberate. I do, Your Honor. She turned to the evidence screen, the digital logs still frozen in place. The prosecution says this evidence is valid, she said, her voice smooth, unwavering. I say it's been tampered with. She let the words settle, let the weight of them dig into the minds of everyone listening. Spencer scoffed. And what exactly are you implying, Miss Hale? Skylar tilted her head, her gaze cool and steady. I'm implying, she said, that someone edited these logs after my arrest. Another ripple through the courtroom. Judge Clayton's expression didn't change, but his fingers tightened around his gavel. Spencer let out a forced chuckle, shaking his head. That's a bold accusation. Do you have any proof? Skylar blinked slowly, as if deciding whether she even needed to entertain the question. Then she turned back to the screen. She raised her hand and pointed to the bottom corner of the digital logs, to a tiny, nearly invisible line of code. Right here, she said. This is a secondary encryption layer. It was added 3 hours after my arrest. The room froze. Skylar let the silence stretch before she spoke again. That means, she continued, whoever made this change wasn't recording my activity in real time. They were altering the data after the fact. Judge Clayton's face remained impassive, but the air around him thickened. Spencer stiffened. That's absurd, he snapped. Who would even have access to make those changes? Skylar met his gaze, and then, slowly, deliberately, she turned her eyes toward Judge Clayton. Boom! The impact was instant. The weight of that single glance sent a shockwave through the courtroom. Skylar wasn't just saying the evidence was tampered with. She was suggesting that someone in power had done it. Clayton's nostrils flared. Miss Hale, he said, his voice cold, I'd advise you to be careful with your insinuations. Skylar didn't blink. I'm just following the facts, Your Honor. The jury was watching now, closely. The reporters were writing faster. Even Spencer looked rattled. Clayton exhaled through his nose, composing himself, then turned to the prosecution. Mr. Spencer, I assume you have an explanation? Spencer hesitated, a fraction of a second too long. The logs were retrieved through standard forensic protocol, he said quickly. If there was any error in the data, it's... Skylar cut in. You're calling it an error? She let the word hang there, let it sound as ridiculous as it was. Then, she turned back to the jury. The prosecution wants you to believe this was a simple mistake, she said. A glitch, a coincidence. But let me ask you this. She paused. Let the tension pull tight. Then she said the words that would crack the case open. If the evidence was altered, then that means someone needed me to be guilty. Silence. No chuckles now. No scoffing. Just the weight of implications sinking in. Someone needed this conviction, and Skylar intended to find out why. Judge Clayton's fingers drummed against his bench. He looked toward Spencer, but Spencer was frozen, stuck. Your Honor, Skylar said, her voice razor-sharp. I move to subpoena all communications between this court and the prosecution regarding my case. Another shockwave. Clayton's grip on his gavel tightened. Miss Hale, he warned. But Skylar saw it now. The way he hesitated. The way his mask slipped, just for a fraction of a second. She was right. And now, she just had to prove it. The air inside the courtroom had changed. It wasn't just heavy now. It was charged like the static in the air before a storm. Every single person in that room, jury, reporters, court officials, felt it. Something bigger was happening here. Skylar stood at the defense table, still measured. But inside, her mind was moving like a live wire. The case was shifting. The moment she called for a subpoena of communications between the court and the prosecution, the power structure of this trial had begun to crack. And now, she was going to rip it wide open. Judge Clayton cleared his throat, gripping his gavel a little too tightly. Miss Hale, this court will not entertain baseless conspiracy theories. Skylar tilted her head slightly. Then why do you look nervous, Your Honors? The courtroom gasped. Spencer stiffened at the prosecution table, his grip tightening around his pen. Even the court stenographer, who had probably transcribed 100 routine cases like this, froze for half a second before continuing to type. Clayton's lips thinned. Careful, Miss Hale? Oh, I'm being careful, she replied, her voice deceptively calm. That's why I'd like to call my next witness. Clayton's brow furrowed. Your next witness? Yes. She turned, eyes locking onto the man seated a few rows back. The only person in this room who hadn't spoken yet. The one who had everything to lose if she was right. Detective Marcus Calloway. Boom. Spencer's chair scraped against the floor as he shot up. Objection. What possible relevance does? Judge Clayton raised a hand. His eyes flicked toward Calloway, who was already shifting uncomfortably. The man wasn't expecting this, which meant he had something to hide. Clayton exhaled. Overruled. Detective Calloway approached the stand. Calloway stood slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his jacket. The man was seasoned, his posture still strong, his face hardened from years in law enforcement. But Skylar saw the tiny tells. The way he rolled his shoulders before walking, an unconscious attempt to loosen tension. The way he didn't quite meet her eyes. The way he exhaled through his nose when he finally sat down like someone bracing for impact. He took the oath, and Skylar approached. Detective Calloway, she began smoothly. Can you confirm that you were the lead investigator on this case? Yes, he replied, his voice clipped. And you personally oversaw the forensic examination of the alleged hacking? Yes. Skylar took a slow step forward. And are you aware, she said, that the digital logs used against me show clear signs of post-arrest modification? The question hung in the air. Calloway hesitated. For just a second too long. I am aware that the logs were reviewed multiple times, he said carefully. Skylar nodded. Right? Multiple times. But can you tell the court who exactly made the modifications? A pause. A longer pause. Judge Clayton exhaled sharply. Detective, answer the question. Calloway's jaw clenched. He stopped shifting in his chair. Then, carefully, that information is classified. Skylar's lips barely twitched. That's interesting, she mused, tilting her head. Because the chain of custody records show that the only people with access to modify those logs were the prosecution. Boom. Spencer's hand slammed against the table. Objection. Clayton looked pale. He hesitated for half a second too long before muttering. Sustained. Skylar turned back to Calloway. Detective, she said, voice sharp now. Did you personally see those logs before my arrest? Another pause. Then, finally, Calloway exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. No. The room exploded. Murmurs, gasps. Reporters typing furiously, jurors glancing at one another. Skylar didn't react. She just let the weight of that single word sink in. No. The lead detective on this case never even saw the original evidence before she was arrested. Judge Clayton slammed his gavel. Order! Order in this courtroom. The murmurs died down, but the energy had changed again. Clayton's grip on his gavel was white-knuckled now. Skylar folded her hands behind her back, looking at Calloway. So let's summarize, she said, voice smooth. You didn't see the evidence before my arrest. The logs were altered after my arrest, and the only people with access to make those changes were the prosecution. Calloway swallowed hard. Skylar turned toward the jury, holding their gaze. So now the question isn't whether I committed this crime, she said. The question is... She paused. Let them lean in. Then, who is framing me? Silence. Judge Clayton's lips pressed into a thin line. That's enough. Skylar turned to him. That's enough? She repeated, her voice sharp. Or is it just enough for you? A beat of silence. Then, for the first time, the judge didn't respond. And Skylar saw it. The fear in his eyes. She was right. And now, she just had to push one step further. The courtroom no longer felt like a place of law. It felt like a trap. One that had been carefully constructed, brick by brick, to ensnare Skylar Hale. The only problem? She had just found the cracks in the walls. Judge Clayton sat rigidly behind the bench, his jaw locked, his fingers curled so tightly around his gavel that the veins in his hands stood out. Detective Calloway, still on the witness stand, was sweating now. His composed demeanor had shattered the moment he admitted the truth. He never saw the original evidence before her arrest. In the prosecution, Spencer looked like he had just swallowed a mouthful of broken glass. The room had turned against him. Skylar could feel it. The jury wasn't convinced of her guilt anymore. They were wondering something else. Who was guilty instead? She turned, letting her gaze sweep over the room, before finally landing back on Calloway. Detective, she said, her voice smooth but edged with steel, you've confirmed that you didn't personally review the original forensic evidence. That means your testimony, everything you've stated in this case, was based on information someone else gave you. Calloway hesitated. That's standard procedure in some cases. Skylar took a slow step forward. Of course, she agreed. But wouldn't you say that in a case like this, where someone's entire future is on the line, it would be irresponsible to rely on secondhand evidence? A pause. A long, telling pause. Calloway shifted in his seat. His discomfort was growing. Skylar held his gaze. Who gave you that evidence? The question landed like a hammer strike. Spencer shot up. Objection. Skylar didn't break eye contact. Who, detective? Calloway's throat bobbed. His gaze flicked toward Spencer. Too quickly. Skylar caught it. So did the jury. Calloway exhaled slowly. It was sent to me through official channels. Skylar's lips curled slightly. She had him now. Official channels, she repeated, feigning curiosity. And by official channels, you mean the district attorney's office. Calloway didn't answer. Spencer's fists clenched at his sides. Skylar turned her attention back to the prosecution. Mr. Spencer, she said, her voice as light as air. Would you care to explain how your office obtained forensic logs that were later proven to be manipulated? Boom. Spencer froze. Clayton's nostrils flared. The gallery was dead silent. Skylar tilted her head, letting the question sink in. Because as far as I understand, the only way your office could have submitted altered logs is if someone on your team, or someone in this very courtroom, was involved in that manipulation. She let the words settle. Let them dig in. Then she delivered the final blow. Which means we're no longer dealing with a trial about cybercrime. She took a step closer. This is about corruption. Boom, boom, boom. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, whispers, reporters frantically typing, jurors shifting in their seats. Skylar barely noticed. She was focused on only one thing. Judge Clayton. The way his grip on his gavel tightened. The way his temple twitched. The way he didn't look surprised. Skylar's stomach coiled. He knew. He had known the entire time. This wasn't just about a crooked prosecutor falsifying evidence. This went deeper. Skylar's heartbeat quickened as the realization hit her. She hadn't just put Spencer on trial. She had put Clayton on trial, too. She turned back to the jury, keeping her voice calm despite the wildfire burning inside her. You have to ask yourselves, she said, who benefited from this case going exactly the way it was supposed to? Her words hung in the air like a noose. Clayton's face was unreadable. Then, finally, he moved. He slammed his gavel down. This court is adjourned until further notice. A frantic, rushed move. Skylar's stomach tightened further. He was trying to shut it down because he was running out of options, and she was getting too close. As the courtroom began to clear, Skylar exhaled, slow and steady. She had started this trial as a defendant. Now, she was about to bring down the most powerful man in this room. And he knew it. The air in the courtroom was thick with unspoken truths. Even after Judge Clayton abruptly adjourned the session, the tension didn't break. It only coiled tighter, like a storm building on the horizon. Skylar didn't move from her seat. She watched, the way the jury whispered among themselves, their eyes darting between her, Spencer, and the judge. The way the reporters scribbled furiously, knowing that this trial was no longer about a simple cybercrime. The way Judge Clayton gripped his gavel like it was the last thing holding his authority together. She had cornered them, and they knew it. But Skylar also knew something else. Men like Clayton? They didn't go down quietly. Outside the courtroom, 10 minutes later, the hall was buzzing with chaos. Cameramen jostled for position. Journalists fired questions at anyone who looked important. Spectators murmured in tight clusters, the conversation a single, tangled thread. What just happened? This trial is bigger than we thought. Did you see the judge's face? Skylar walked through it all, shoulders squared, her face unreadable. Behind her, she could hear Spencer's footsteps, quick and agitated, as he pushed through the crowd. "Hale," he called. Skylar didn't stop. "Miss Hale," he snapped louder now. She exhaled through her nose, then turned, slow, deliberate. "Yes, Mr. Spencer?" He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't going to go the way you think it is." Skylar raised a brow. "Oh, and how do I think it's going to go?" Spencer's jaw tightened. "You got lucky in there, but that luck won't last. You have no proof Clayton is involved in any wrongdoing.